This week, I thought I'd talk about the main ways I go about combating weeds. We have a small piece of land here in New Zealand and are living fully off the grid. We have a vegetable garden and I recently planted 50 fruit trees. The fruit trees are surrounded by Kikuyu grass, which is about as invasive as weeds get. I'm not a big fan of weeding, I guess nobody is, but I pretty much don't do it. Instead, I do other things. So the first thing I do is I put down quite a lot of mulch. I got 5 cubic meters of mulch a few months back of wood chip, and I've been adding it to the garden. I use about a wheelbarrow per tree and just kind of fill it out around the drip line. Quite a lot of it, probably 6 inches deep, and that's enough to block out most of the weeds. I say most of them. As well as blocking out the weeds, all this mulch acts as a kind of blanket, so it stabilises the temperature for the roots. So in the summer that means you cut down on the amount of evaporation and the amount of heat hitting the soil, and then in the winter it protects the roots from the cold. I also occasionally clear some of the mulch away from the trunk of the tree because I don't want all that wet stuff just hanging around the trunk that will eventually cause mould and rot and problems for the tree. So I just give it a bit of space around here. It'll eventually fall back, but every now and again I just give it a bit of space, especially for a tree like this. This is just a young avocado. Another good thing about mulching is all this wood chip is going to eventually break down over the next sort of year or two, and it will improve the quality of the soil. The topsoil here, as you can see, is pretty decent, but beneath this thin layer, it turns to clay, which isn't particularly great. But with this breaking down, it will provide a lot more nutrients for this nectarine tree. So in the veggie garden, I'm using wood chip as pathways, but it's fairly thin and it's definitely not enough to suppress the weeds and the grass. So in this situation, I'm using a layer of cardboard first. Over time, the cardboard will break down, but by then, the grass and the weeds beneath it will all be dead. And that will mean that there's some biomass for the vegetables to then root into. So that works in this situation where the grass isn't that tough, but what happens when the grass or the weeds are really hardy and really pernicious? I've planted about 50 trees here over the last few months, and the ones behind me are all planted in Kikuyu. The problem with Kikuyu is it uses a rhizome. There's the Kikuyu grass, and here's the rhizome. The problem with that is if you're suppressing the weeds by putting mulch over it, if it's getting its energy from elsewhere, you're going to have a hard time with it. And there's a lot of weeds that work in that way. So things like Japanese knotweed, bindweed, poison ivy, they all use rhizomes, and that's when it gets a little bit harder to suppress them. Over the last few days, I've been planting loads of comfrey. This is a little grapefruit tree here, and there's some comfrey. It looks like it's got a little bit of transplant shock, but it's strong stuff. It will come back. Good thing about comfrey is it grows so fast. It just overtakes most of the weeds, and therefore it kind of shades them all out as the leaf. You can see how big these get. They also bring up nitrogen from deep down in the ground. They send down their roots, they bring up the nitrogen from the ground, and then you can just chop them and leave them like a chop and drop plant. You leave them as a mulch, and that makes it much easier for the tree to get hold of the nutrients and get hold of that nitrogen. The other good thing about comfrey is that here, all of these banks are clay. It's not particularly great, but when the roots of the comfrey go down, they're actually kind of breaking up the soil, they're aerating it and probably improving the drainage quite a bit as well. I've also heard that the comfrey plant, the way it sends down roots, it almost creates a barrier which is very difficult for weeds like Kikuyu or grass like Kikuyu to get through. I haven't seen that myself, and I'm sort of somewhat skeptical, but I'm going to try it out. I think I'll plant a row of it and see what happens with the Kikuyu, whether it actually does stop it, but it will be interesting to find out. So for pretty much all the trees I've planted, I've used all three of those methods. So I've used cardboard, then mulch, and then I've planted comfrey into that. But I recently heard about something called Mexican sunflower, or tree marigold, there's one here. They're massively popular within the kind of permaculture space, and I thought, let's give it a go. Apparently the roots reach down, this provides a huge amount of nutrients for the soil, and it also stops invasive weeds. I haven't tried using this before, so I thought, just out of curiosity, for the 3 trees I've got behind me, I thought I'll do different things for each tree and see which one of these methods works the best. So I'll plant Mexican sunflower in one of them, and then I'll use cardboard on the other one, and I'll use comfrey on the other one, and I'll mulch each one with wood chip. So I figure if one of these methods can stop Kikuyu grass, it should be able to stop pretty much any weed. But let's check back in a few months, see how we go.